This is Including You, the new series from Lead at Any Level. Including You features stories from chief diversity officers and other executives who are creating inclusive cultures in their organizations. Our goal is to show what's working in companies just like yours, to give you the tools you need to keep pushing for progress in your own workplace. We want to create belonging and opportunity for everyone, including you. And now here's your host, Amy C. Waninger.
Welcome back to Including You. I'm your host, Amy C. Waninger, the Inclusion Catalyst. My guest today is my friend, Sylvia Baffour. She is an international speaker. She is amazing, and I can't wait for you to meet her. Sylvia, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am excited to share you with my friends, listeners, and viewers because I think you're fascinating. You are so accomplished in your work as a professional speaker, as an emotional intelligence expert. And I just want people to learn a little bit about what it is you do and who you do it for, and how your work on emotional intelligence ties to the inclusion efforts of the clients that you serve. So can you tell us just a little bit about who you work with?
Yeah, I was going to say that's a loaded question, but I guess it really isn't, because the majority of clients I work with at the moment, really, it's the spectrum from people in leadership, people in managerial positions, administrative professionals who are looking to increase their ability to communicate and interact effectively with those in their spaces at work. And so the corporate America space, a lot of nonprofit work as well that I do. So when I look at my client base, it's a spectrum. You go from Doctors Without Borders or the World Bank to Department of Defense to Lockheed Martin and Nationwide and a few other companies in between. So the work I do focuses heavily around helping individuals within these organizations to build thriving work cultures where people, I call it the experience Sundays with tranquility and look forward to Mondays. Can you build a culture where people are experiencing their Sunday evenings with tranquility, as opposed to having the Sunday scaries and stuff like that? And I know emotional intelligence is at the heart of so much of what makes an organization's culture really thrive and have that psychological safety that so many of us crave when we want to show up in the morning to give our best.
Yes. And can you explain to folks who may not be familiar with the term emotional intelligence, can you explain a little bit about what that means and how that shows up at work?
Yeah, I'm often asked how I define it, because I think sometimes we can get a little bit intellectual and complicated with the idea of emotional intelligence. And so I simply like to look at it as this: how aware are you of your own emotions at any given moment of the day? And how much do you care about the impact your emotions are having on you and the people around you? So really, that is it in a nutshell. How aware are you of your own emotions and the impact they're having on you and the people around you? And what was there's another question to that?
No, that was really it. Just how do you define it and how does it show up at work? I guess was the other part.
Yes. Yeah. So it shows up in two ways, right? When it's present and when it's absent. Not really showing up in that case, but in collaboration, do you have silos happening in your organization because people don't trust each other and want to box in their institutional knowledge? And it shows up with a leader who doesn't have the empathy to understand that people have lives outside of the workplace and make those accommodations. It shows up in a leader who thinks that they can have one style of leadership for a diverse audience, a diverse team, a diverse group of people that they're serving. It shows up in the lack of trust, or the leader who takes time to use empathic communication to build trust and psychological safety. So it just shows up in all the ways that our human skills ought to show up, because we exist in relation to one another. None of us exists in isolation, whether you have customers or clients or direct reports or team members. And if you're not invested in learning how to have more effective relationships with those you interact with, then you're at a loss.
I love the way you said that it shows up when it's there and it shows up when it's not there, because I think this is something that a lot of leaders missed out on. Leadership has changed a lot in the last 10, 20, 30, 50 years, but unfortunately, leaders haven't changed that much. In terms of the composition of leaders, but even some of the people that have been leaders for 50 years are still around doing things, trying to do things the same way they used to. So what is it that you think people most need to learn, or what's the first step for your clients in learning about emotional intelligence or EQ?
I think it's a logical first step that we all begin with the journey to increasing our self-awareness. But Amy, what I want to distinguish is oftentimes we focus so much of our energy on internal self-awareness and not enough on external. So I like to look at it this way. Internal self-awareness is the mirror effect, as I like to call it. You take a mirror and put it up to yourself, and you observe what's looking back at you, and you make improvements based on what you uncover about yourself. And it's the reason why I don't always think a lot of EI assessments are complete, because you are sitting down to analyze and assess yourself on how you are moving through this world. So the missing component that isn't often emphasized is the external self-awareness. So it's good for you to take assessments and understand more about who you are and how people how you're moving through this world. But the external self-awareness says, can I ask a handful of questions of people in my personal and professional spaces who can give me a spotlight on my blind spots, who can illuminate? I call it the prism perspective, because I think of it as when you shine a light on a prism, no matter what angle the light comes out, it refracts this beautiful rainbow. And in the same way, as we shine a light on who we are from the outside, from other people's experiences of us, it allows us to look at our lives in a much richer and more expansive way. So starting off with growing your emotional intelligence has to begin with looking at what you can do to improve your internal self-awareness, but also your external. And I actually argue that external self-awareness matters even more, because back again, if you're dealing with diverse people who have different lived experiences from you, it's vital that you have an awareness of how people experience you. When I often talk to leaders about this idea that in order to influence others, which is what leadership is all about, you must begin by influencing how they experience you. So how do you get to know about that is through the external self-awareness, being able to pull 3 to 5 colleagues in your professional spaces and in your personal, and you ask them questions like, how do you think I deal with stress? Do you find me to be somebody who's intolerant of other people's ideas? And make it anonymous. Use SurveyMonkey or some other anonymous survey and just get a bit more centered, because you might see some common things coming up saying, oh, I didn't realize people were experiencing me this way. So I talk about how important it is for us to bridge the gap between how we think others are experiencing us and how they actually are. That is where the dance of life really takes place, and where the magic happens when it comes to saying, I am on the journey to being more emotionally intelligent.
I think that's brilliant. That missing piece of feedback from others. And a lot of leaders, let's be honest, have not been taught how to receive feedback constructive, particularly from the people that don't hold power over them. And to seek it out intentionally and to create a space where people feel safe giving it to them, I would think would be very difficult, or could at least feel very difficult to start. Has that been your experience?
It has. And actually, I work a lot with leaders on how they behave in the face of feedback, because no one likes to be criticized. It's not, I don't know many human beings who love to be criticized and look forward to that. But I work with leaders to help them understand that if you say, I'm open to feedback, I have an open door policy, this sort of thing, and yet when you are given that feedback, your reaction is diametrically opposed to somebody who was genuinely open to it, you're really teaching people that you can't take feedback, and therefore people start hiding things from you, which crumbles the culture. And one of the things I talk a lot about is what I call minding your monologue. The conversations we have with ourselves when we're hearing things that don't feel right, don't sit right with us, that we want to challenge, we disagree with. Just stopping sometimes in the midst of those moments and saying, am I minding my monologue? What is the self-talk I'm having right now in my head about what I'm hearing? Is it, if it's criticism, you're saying, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. Is that the conversation you're having in your head? Or it's possible you're seeing things from a different perspective. So it's important to really grab a hold of the self-talk, because what goes on in our minds is what directly influences what we do next in our lives. In every moment of the day, it's starting in the head. And so if you're sitting around getting feedback from direct reports, like in a 360, you can start by saying, I know this is going to be difficult to hear because no one likes to be criticized. But I know that at the end of this, I will be aware of things I could improve upon. And if I'm invested in the culture of my organization and in my team and wanting to build trust and psychological safety, this is a journey I have to go on. So this is the self-talk you're having. When it's people's opinions of how they experience you, and you can filter that. Sometimes someone just doesn't like you, period. But oftentimes there's some truth to the feedback. And if leaders, I try to get them to be very mindful to not be dismissive of the feedback just because it's coming from 2 levels down. Where you could say, is it possible that somebody is experiencing me this way? What could I do differently to allow you to feel like when you come to me and ask a question, I'm not shutting you down? Yes, it's a dialogue. And I think if we leave our egos at the door as leaders, we can really create cohesion and productivity amongst our teams. And when teams see you leaving your ego at the door, they're open to coming with feedback and innovation and creativity, and all these things start happening because they see you as someone who, no matter how hard a truth is, you take it in stride, versus lip service, where you say you will, and then you act upon it by getting them off a project or something on the back end.
Yeah, I think I've seen a lot of leaders punish people for doing the thing they were asked to do. So if you ask someone for feedback and they give it to you and you fly off the handle, or you deny it, or you dismiss it, or you get defensive, you're essentially punishing the person for doing what you asked. And it makes it really hard to build trust. One of the tools, if I may, that I try to give leaders is when somebody gives you feedback that you don't like, that you're not comfortable with, it's like when your grandma gets you an ugly sweater that itches. You may not like it, but if it fits, you got to think about what you're going to do next. And so I always tell leaders, when you hear feedback that is really hard to take and you feel yourself having an emotional reaction, train yourself to say, thank you, I'd like some time to think about this. And then just stop, because that gives you, number one, the responsibility to actually think about it. But 2, you don't have to respond in the moment. You can give yourself that space to really process. And just that has made a huge difference in my life, because sometimes people will say stuff to me. I'm like, that can't be true. It attacks who I believe I am. And in the moment, it hurts and it's scary and it's awful. And I feel like I've been physically backed into a corner. But then after a couple of days, when it calms down, when the emotion of it calms down, oh, yeah, I can see how that could happen, or how somebody could feel that way, or how that might have sounded.
Yeah. That's why it's important for leaders not to use language like, I'm sorry you think I was criticizing you. It's not, you're not really taking ownership. Yeah. So
I'm sorry you're offended is not an apology.
Yeah, no, it's not. I'm sorry I offended you. Yes, that's because it's their reality. That's the experience.
Absolutely. Sylvia, I'm curious, can you share with us how you got into this work?
It's a question I often ask myself as well, because I feel like I'm peeling back the layers for the answer, because I got certified as a life coach about 21 years ago now, maybe 22. And when the industry was very young and new and unregulated, and I'd always had a passion to help people navigate the problems of their lives. And oftentimes it was happening over a glass of wine at a bar somewhere with someone telling me their issues, right? But so that sort of morphed into my professional speaking business, my life coaching practice after a couple of years. And for the first 10 years of my 19-year journey, I often like to say that I feel like I was a bit of a wandering generality instead of becoming a meaningful specific. So people would know that I was a speaker and a coach, but you didn't really know what I spoke about. And so having gotten the clarity about my emotional intelligence work in the last 7 years, I look back and realize that even when I didn't know what to call it, I was doing emotional intelligence work, because you don't have to go to school and read a book to be emotionally intelligent. I had very emotionally intelligent parents who didn't use that term, emotional intelligence, but I observed them. I watched my parents, my father, just navigating difficult conversations as a businessman and still leaving people feeling respected and human. And so I realized that for the last 30 years of my lived experiences, I've been paying attention to the importance of, Jim Carrey put it best when he said, the effect you have on others is the most valuable currency there is, right? The effect that you have on others is the most valuable currency there is. And I realized from 30 years ago, that is what I'd been trying to practice in not so many terms. Because of an incident that happened to me as a teenager, where the perception of how I was moving through this world was very incongruent with how the girls in my boarding school were experiencing me. And I made a commitment then to never be in a position where it was so big a gap between how I think I was being experienced and how I actually was. And so back then I was doing emotional intelligence work even before I knew what to call it. And it's more formally in the last 7 or so years that I understood that this is what I'm doing, is emotional intelligence work. And then I wrote my book 4 years ago, I Dare You to Care, which was really a challenge and an invitation for all of us to be more mindful about the way we are moving through this world, because the effect we have on others does indeed matter.
Yes, and I believe it was your mentor, wasn't it, Maya Angelou, who said, people forget what you say, they will forget what you did, but they will remember how you made them feel.
100%, 100%. And yeah, what I like to now call the emotional aftertaste of your interactions with others. Is it sweet or sour? People feel a certain way having been in your presence. People will never forget how you make them feel, 100%. And there's work that we have to all do behind the scenes to be that kind of person that others enjoy being around. So often, I'm sure each one of us can think of 1 or 2 people in our lives who are incredibly enjoyable to be around. You see their number come across your phone, you're interrupting yourself to answer the phone. And how often do we sit down and think about what they do to make them so enjoyable to be around? We just take it for granted that this is somebody who listens to me, doesn't interrupt. They lead with curiosity instead of judgment. They allow me to feel seen and valued, and they're objective about their perspectives on life. That's behind the scenes work that someone is doing so that you can sit and have an enjoyable time around them. And I think more of us need to do what we can to be those very people to others.
I think that's a beautiful lesson for all of us. And what's interesting, as you were saying that, there are people that I feel that way about. I don't even know why. I maybe only met them one time. There are also people that I can't even remember how I know them. But when I see their name or they pop up in my feed on LinkedIn or whatever, I almost have a recoil reaction. And then I have to go back and think, now, why did I feel that way about that person? And it might just be the tiniest little something in an interaction that we had one time, but it's there. And so we do need to be so mindful of how we leave others. And I love that term, emotional aftertaste. That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's so critical because I often joke around with myself and I say in each of our interactions with others, are people craving our presence or are people craving our absence? And I think that's important for us to all have a self-inventory sometimes. Am I moving through this world in such a way that people crave to be around me, or are they repulsed by my very presence? And I was doing a keynote presentation last week for some women leaders at the Virginia Bankers Association. And one of the things I said to them is that I have never been positively influenced by somebody I cannot stand to be around. And isn't that the truth? And so emotional intelligence is all about moving through this world with consciousness and intention so that the way we intend to be received and experienced is actually how people experience us.
And I think this becomes even more important, more critical when you're trying to lead a diverse team and people don't all see you the same way. And you have to learn to adapt and create some nuance in your interactions with people based on what they need and what they perceive and what they bring to the environment, not just what you do. Would you agree?
Yes. And it's also the reason why leadership is a sophisticated skill, because as you mentioned, the more diverse we become, the smaller this world becomes, filled with people with such varying interests and experiences. Leaders need to become masterful at reading the room, because you have people on your team who you can tell it like it is and they're fine. You have others who you tell it like it is and you've emotionally bruised them and now it's become an HR issue. And oftentimes I talk to leaders about the fact that this is the work, whether you know you signed up for it or not. You are leading human beings, not robots. And so you cannot see the investment of time to get to know what people in your teams need from you. It cannot be, I don't have time to do that, because the ramifications of not investing time in your diverse group to make people feel included, to make them feel a sense of belonging, as well. It's work worth doing if you're going to be a leader. If not, then you just go back to a more technical role where you could be in a lab by yourself and never interact with human beings. But if you take on the role of leadership, you must understand that it comes with the territory, that you've got to mold your leadership style. And it's not selling out or acquiescing or having people have their way, because it's just about being effective and it's about influence. And so the type A's in the room versus the opposite of whatever that is, you've got to meet them where they are, and you cannot see it as catering. I have a diverse team, and I celebrate that. And I celebrate the skills that I'm developing in being able to maneuver these personality differences and meet people where they are and help them with what they need. I think that you pat yourself on the back when you get to that point of leadership where you see it as a privilege to have such skill, to dynamically move in and out of your teams and give each person what they need from you. That just builds so much influence and trust, doesn't it?
And to do it authentically, not in a overly charismatic,
right,
manipulative way, but in a shallow way, but in a very deep and personal way. Which
Mm.
I think some leaders have confused those two things as well. If I can get what I need out of people, then I've done the right thing, as opposed to if I can give people what they truly need.
Yeah. It's often the reason that I say that I was doing a podcast yesterday and I talked about these 3 levels of empathy, cognitive, we call them layers: cognitive empathy, compassionate empathy, and emotional empathy is the middle one. And you have a lot of leaders who are ill-intended, who are narcissistic, because we've all worked with somebody who is just so full of themselves. Narcissistic leaders, we've got to be aware and be careful, because they can be masterful at cognitive empathy. Because cognitive empathy simply requires an intellectual understanding of where someone's coming from. And narcissists are probably the best at doing that, but they're doing it just so they can use it against you or come from an advantage point. But they have no capabilities of emotional empathy, of feeling with you. And then compassionate empathy, which is the next step of doing something to impact your well-being positively. So you're right. It's got to be authentic, because people will see right through it if it's not right through it.
Absolutely. Sylvia, I can talk to you all day, and sometimes I get to, and it's amazing. And can you let folks know where they can find you if they would like to engage with you more and bring you in to speak or to coach, or to engage with their organization?
Absolutely. I think probably the easiest way to find me is on LinkedIn. And the reason I say this is because I post 3 times a week. And so I'd love to engage with any of your listeners. So you just go to LinkedIn and look for Sylvia Baffour. And thankfully, I think I'm the only one by that name on LinkedIn. So pretty easy to find. You can also find me through my website, which is sylviaspeaks.com. But LinkedIn is where I'd love to engage and just learn about how you connected with me, and if I can be of value, if I can assist in coaching your executive team or coming in to do a leadership retreat or a keynote, I'd be thrilled to do that.
Excellent. And I'll make sure that those links are in the show notes as well. Sylvia Baffour, my friend, my colleague, thank you so much for your time, for your expertise, and just for your spirit today.
It's been a plum pleasing pleasure. Thank you so much.
If you've enjoyed this episode, follow Lead at Any Level on LinkedIn and YouTube. Then join us for Including You video simulcast every Thursday at noon Eastern. Including You can also be enjoyed each week as part of the Living Corporate audio podcast series, available on all major podcast platforms. Learn more at living-corporate.com. Including You is brought to you in part by Lead at Any Level, a boutique training and consulting firm improving employee engagement and retention for companies that promote from within. Lead at Any Level. Leaders can be anywhere and should be everywhere. Learn more at leadatanylevel.com. Lead at Any Level and its logo are registered trademarks of Lead at Any Level LLC. The views and opinions of guests on our show do not necessarily reflect the positions of Lead at Any Level, Living Corporate, or the sponsors of Including You.
That's it for this week's episode of Including You. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to leave us a review or a comment to help others find us as well. Be sure to join me next week when my guest will be James Dyson from Think Evolutionary.